Hi, and welcome back to College Questions. If you've never been to my channel before, I'm Nick. I'm the founder of Dawes Academics Consulting, and I'm an independent educational consultant. It's my job to sort of help students and families understand all the different aspects of the college application process so that they can apply with confidence and without stress and a whole lot of additional questions about should I do this or should I do that or is this a good idea, etc. And last week, I talked about standardized testing and do you even need a test score in order to apply to many of these colleges? And for the vast majority of colleges, the answer is no, you don't need it. There is only a handful of test required colleges out there. However, as I said in the last video, I always would like to be over prepared. So I would rather that you have the test score and not need it than to need the test score and not have it. It can also be useful for placement tests or for merit scholarships. And so those are some additional ways that you can benefit from taking the SAT or ACT. This week, I wanted to talk about which test you should take, the SAT or the ACT. A lot of students might ask, well, which test is better? Which one is going to be more ideal? And as with most things with applying to college, the answer is it depends. I always recommend that students try both and see which one they like better. You know, some students are going to prefer the SAT, some students are going to prefer the ACT, and it's really going to depend on which one works best for you. On the East and West Coast, the SAT tends to be a little bit more common. High schools use the SAT, or the PSAT, I should say, sophomore and or junior year. And so students are exposed to the SAT in the way that it asks questions a little bit more often than they are the ACT if you live on the West Coast or the East Coast. It's also true that College Board runs AP testing and the SAT. And so students who take AP tests are also going to be exposed to those tests in the way the College Board formulates those questions, which sometimes is similar to the way that they ask questions on the SAT. So for that reason, you might find the SAT more comfortable. If you live in the Midwest or the Great Plains, your school might use the pre-ACT, or you might live in a state where the ACT is used as the standardized test that you take in order to determine how much you've grown over the last year as a student. And so you might be more familiar with the ACT and for that reason prefer the ACT. There's no real right or wrong answer, and the colleges don't necessarily prefer one over the other in that sense. So as far as that goes, pick which one you're more comfortable with. For students who really don't know or really aren't sure, I recommend try both. There are free practice tests online for the SAT and the ACT. Grab a timer, take the SAT, sit down for 3 hours and do it. Use that same timer, sit down on a different day. Don't do them both in one day, but on a different day, sit down and, for 3 hours, take the ACT. Score them both, see how you did, see which one maybe you scored better on. Using a concordance table, which is a table that you can look up in order to compare your SAT and ACT score. And then you can also determine which one did you like better. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about what the SAT is like, what the ACT is like, highlight the differences, and help you figure out which one might work better for you. So let's go ahead and start with the SAT. What is the SAT like? Well, ever since 2016, which was the last time College Board revamped the SAT, the SAT has been out of 1,600 points, and it has 2 scored sections. It has one math section broken into 2 subparts, and it has one evidence-based reading and writing section, which is broken down into 2 parts, one reading, one writing. The score is for each section is out of 800, and then they just add those 2 scores together to get you your maximum possible score of 1,600. Incidentally, the minimum possible score is 400. You basically get 200 points for each section for writing your name correctly on the bubble sheet at the front of the test booklet. So your score ranges from 400 to 1,600. The SAT is 3 hours long, And it tends to give a little bit more time per question than the ACT does. You're going to have about 75 seconds per question for reading, 48 seconds per question for writing, and 83 seconds per question for math. The math section has 58 questions and breaks down into the two subsections I mentioned earlier. One of them is a calculator section. The other one is a no calculator section. They will also provide a reference page in the math section that's got some common formulas. They're usually geometric formulas, things to have to do with circumference, radius, volume, chords, diameter. And they'll give you the volume formulas for different shapes like cones and cylinders and spheres, etc. The SAT does have a bigger focus on algebra and algebra 2. And so if you're in Algebra 2 or you took Algebra 2 as a freshman or sophomore, and you're ready to take the SAT in terms of the math content that's on the test. In terms of geometry, there will be some, but not a lot. We're talking maybe 3 questions, about 5-ish% of the test. At most, maybe 4 questions of geometry. So there's not a huge geometry focus for the SAT. We'll save that for the ACT, which we'll talk about in a minute. The SAT will also ask about 13-ish questions where you have to calculate the answer yourself and then write the answer into your answer sheet. And you'll have to bubble the corresponding numbers so that the answer scanner can read your answers. But it's not all multiple choice. Okay, these 13 questions, they give you the problem and they don't give you answer choices. You have to calculate the answer yourself and then write it in. And so you need to be careful with, decimal points and fractions and things like that when you're answering those questions. All the other 45 questions, however, are going to be multiple choice. For reading and writing, they're both going to utilize passages that are between 500 and 700 words. The reading section will have 5 passages, about 10 to 11 questions per passage for a total of 52 questions. There will be one literature-based passage, like an excerpt from a novel. There will be one passage that's historical in nature, usually a historical document. Sometimes they use, an excerpt from Federalist 51 or the Constitution or, a speech given on the floor of the House regarding the 13th Amendment, something about the Mexican-American War, who knows, but it'll be some sort of historical document, something written 100 years ago or more. There will be one passage on social science, so this will be a non-fiction passage that talks about some sort of phenomenon or historical event. And then there will be 2 science passages. One will be some sort of physical science and one will be a natural science. Usually, in terms of difficulty, all of these passages are sort of late high school reading level, roughly equivalent to reading an article in the New York Times, for instance. The SAT will also give you about 7 or 8 questions in the reading section on vocabulary, and they almost always take the form of, in the context of the passage, blank word in line, whatever, 42, most nearly means. And then they'll give you 4 answer choices for a rough approximation of the meaning of that word used in the context of the sentence in the passage. The writing section will have 4 passages of its own, 11 questions per passage for a total of 44 questions. Approximately 20, or just under half of these, will be related to grammar and punctuation. The remaining 24 questions are going to be focused on rhetoric and style. These are going to be questions about, like, how do you want to organize these paragraphs in order to be most effective? Or if the author wanted to insert additional information, where should they add that information? And they'll give you the snippet of info to add. And they'll ask you where it makes the most sense to place that information. Or, what can be added to improve the persuasiveness of this passage? Or what can be removed? What's the least helpful piece of information, or a piece of information that doesn't belong in a particular paragraph? The writing section will also have about 3 to 4 questions on vocabulary as well, in the exact same way that the reading passage does it. Both the reading and the writing sections will incorporate graphs, charts, and tables. This is different from the ACT. The graphs, charts, and tables are going to ask you to synthesize information, to take information from the chart and compare it to the information in the article. And they could ask you to draw conclusions or predict an outcome. They'll say, based on the data in the chart and the information in the passage, if this set of inputs were to be given, what would be the outcome? Other times it's going to ask you to compare the data from the table or chart to the information in the passage, and maybe something in the table is incorrect or doesn't agree with the information in the passage. Sometimes maybe the passage is incorrect and needs to be corrected to better align with the information in the passage or in the chart or graph. And so it might ask you to do some information correction, assuming one of the two is true. And that's going to be your SAT. You got the 4 subsections, the reading, writing, calculator math, and no calculator math, that score into 2 major sections, evidence-based reading and writing, and math. Each is out of 200 to 800, adds up to a total of 1,600 possible points. For the ACT, we're going to have 4 sections. Okay, we're going to have an English section, a reading section, a math section, and a science section. Okay. Each section gives you a possible score of 1 to 36. And then these scores are averaged to create a composite score out of 36. This is important because on the one hand, a low score in one section can be averaged up if you do really well in other sections. On the other hand, increasing your composite score is going to be a little bit harder because the way the ACT rounds is that it rounds on the 0.75. So you need to increase your weakest section score by 3 points to see a 1 point increase in your composite score, assuming all the other section scores stayed the same. I should add that. So in a way, the composite score is nice because it'll hide weaker scores. But if you're really trying to improve your score, you're going to need to see significant improvement in your weak section in order to actually raise your composite score substantially, right? To get 3 additional points on an ACT composite, you're going to have to raise your weak section by 9 points, or raise your weak section by 6 and raise a few other sections by 2 or something like that in order to really see an increase in the average. It's a lot harder, or it can be a lot harder, to raise your score in that way. So the test is about 5 minutes shorter than the SAT. It's 2 hours and 55 minutes. Still basically 3 hours. The big thing, though, is that the ACT provides way less time per question than the SAT does. You're going to have 53 seconds and 36 seconds per question for reading and for English. And so this compares, let me just pull my numbers up here. This compares with the SAT, which gives you 75 seconds for reading instead of 53 seconds. And they give you 48 seconds per question for writing versus the ACT giving you 36 seconds per question for writing. So we're talking about a 25 to 30% decrease in the amount of time per section, or per question per section. For math, you're going to have 60 seconds per question. And for science, you're going to have 53 seconds per question. So the ACT math has 60 questions, and they give you 1 hour, 60 seconds per question. You have a minute per question on the math section. However, the math section is entirely multiple choice compared to the SAT, which has those 13, fill-in options that you have to do yourself. The whole section allows you to use a calculator versus the calculator-based and the non-calculator-based sections for the SAT math. However, the ACT does not give you that formula reference sheet for all of the geometric formulas for volume and circumference and radii and etc. And the ACT has way more geometry on it and way less Algebra 2 than the SAT does. So for students who don't like geometry, you're probably going to prefer the SAT math to the ACT math. But for students who maybe aren't on an advanced math track where you're taking Algebra 2 as a freshman or a sophomore, you might find the ACT math a little bit easier because it doesn't involve as much Algebra 2, but it is going to substitute in a little bit more geometry and some visual questions regarding angles and triangles and circles and all of these things. So that's a significant difference between the SAT and the ACT. For the ACT specifically, we're talking about 14 questions involving geometry, as opposed to about 3 to 4 of them on the SAT involving geometry. So it's a much larger geometry focus. The rest is algebra and algebra 2, but primarily algebra. For the ACT reading, you're going to have 4 passages, not 5. And these are going to always break into the same 4 categories. It's very similar to the SAT, but not quite the same. You will have one, what they call prose fiction. This is the same as the SAT literature. It's an excerpt from some sort of novel or short story. You will have one humanities-based passage, probably something nonfiction about a particular author or about a particular like architect or artist. You'll have a social science passage, again, nonfiction. This could be on, psychology or history or economics, any number of nonfiction social science subjects. And then you'll have one natural science passage, and again, nonfiction. Each passage will ask exactly 10 questions for a total of 40 questions. The passages are a little bit easier than the SAT passages. They're sort of like a mid-high school reading level, so a little bit easier to read than the New York Times will be. And around 5 of the questions, just over 10% of the questions will be vocabulary-based questions. And the ACT asks vocab questions in much the same way that the SAT does. The ACT English section is way longer than the SAT version. It's going to be 75 questions. And they only give you 36 seconds per question for a total of 45 minutes. The English section on the ACT spends less time on rhetoric than it does on grammar and punctuation. About just under half of the questions are on rhetoric and style. But the SAT will ask you questions about the passage as a whole far more frequently than the ACT will. And the way that the SAT asks you rhetoric and style questions, they ask a lot about essay organization. And in order to answer those questions successfully, you need to understand the whole passage and how all the different paragraphs relate to each other. The ACT does not ask nearly as many of those sorts of questions. And so it's much easier to just sort of skip from English question to English question without having to fully grasp the whole passage. There might be a question towards the end of each passage where you need to have some understanding of the whole passage, but not nearly as many of those sorts of questions as the SAT. So it's a little bit easier to jump around and just answer questions pretty quickly, given that they give you so much less time and they ask you so many more questions. Neither the English or the reading section, I'll say again, are going to use charts or tables or graphs, unlike the SAT. The ACT does not do that. They save that for the science section, which is the 4th section and the biggest differentiator between the SAT and the ACT. The SAT tests science by testing your data analysis and synthesis with reading and writing passages. The ACT tests it with its own discrete section. This section will give you some reading, maybe a short passage, no more than 250, 300 words or so. And then they'll give you some sort of diagram or chart or image for you to use in conjunction with the passage to answer 5 to 8 questions per passage. There will be 6 or 7 passages for a total of 40 questions. Sorry. You have 40 questions, 35 minutes to complete the 40 questions. So again, it's fairly quick. The science section is often the most challenging section for students taking the ACT because you're doing some reading comprehension and combining it with the diagrams and charts and images. And it's very easy to make silly mistakes because you're trying to go very fast through that whole section. All of these passages in the science section will involve applying a scientific principle, summarizing an experiment that's been described and shown in diagrams. It might ask you to talk about the results of the experiment or examining how an experiment is set up and whether or not it's going to be successful. The time constraint on this section is really the most challenging aspect of it. So that's the SAT and the ACT. So if you want to go to the blog post in my description about these two tests, you'll see some tables that compare the amount of time per question for the different sections and those sorts of things. But in general, the SAT gives you more time per question for the same section as the ACT. We're talking 75 seconds versus 53 for reading, 83 seconds versus 60 seconds for math, 48 seconds versus 36 seconds for writing on the SAT versus the ACT. The ACT is always much faster. So if you are someone who takes a long time to understand and process written words, you might find the ACT a little bit overwhelming in the amount of reading you have to do in such a short amount of time. The SAT does ask questions in a slightly less direct way that could pose a challenge, but given you have so much more time to understand the questions being asked, it might feel less overwhelming. That time constraint might not feel like such a burden on the SAT if you're someone who struggles with reading comprehension or reading and understanding things quickly. Maybe you read just fine, but it takes you a few extra seconds to really connect all the dots and understand what's being asked of you. For math, we're really looking at a difference of stopping with geometry and stopping with algebra 2. For students who don't like geometry but are maybe on an accelerated math course and finish algebra 2 as a freshman or a sophomore, you're going to find the SAT way easier. It's way less geometry. You've already completed algebra 2. Cool. For students who maybe are on a regular math track and not aiming to take Calculus BC as seniors, the SAT's Algebra 2 requirement is going to pose you a bit of a scheduling problem, which I'll discuss in a future video, because you won't finish Algebra 2 until the end of your junior year. And so it's going to become difficult to schedule your SAT and prep for it and have Algebra 2 done all at the same time. And I'll discuss more on how to do that and how to make that happen in the next video. But know that for that, the SAT is going to be harder. If you're on a regular math track, the ACT math is definitely going to be easier and more direct. It's all multiple choice. There are a few Algebra 2 questions, but not a lot. It's going to be a much heavier burden on geometry, or a much larger share of the test is on geometry. And so you might find that a little bit more manageable than the SAT math. So keep that in mind. Like, what is your comfort level with geometry versus Algebra 2? When are you going to take Algebra 2 and complete that course? Because that will determine when it makes sense for you to take your standardized tests. The last difference between the two tests that'll really impact whether you should take the SAT or the ACT is the difficulty of the reading. The SAT uses more complex passages that are of sort of an end of high school senior year, maybe freshman of college reading level, where the ACT is going to use more like a sophomore year reading level on its passages. It also asks questions in a much more direct fashion than the SAT does. So if you really do struggle with reading comprehension, or you feel like your vocabulary is not as strong as it could be, or you just don't have the exposure to more complex literature for whatever reason, you might find the ACT reading a bit easier and more manageable despite having less time per question. I usually recommend students try taking the reading section timed just to see what that's like, but then also try it again with a different test untimed and see how you do. Because if you do really well untimed, then it's the time management that you need to work on, and you can work on getting faster. And then you can try it timed and see how you do, to sort of see how far apart your ability is from your ability to manage the time on the ACT specifically. But you should always compare a timed score to a timed score and an untimed score to an untimed score. So if you're looking at your SAT practice test and your ACT practice test and trying to decide which to take, don't compare an untimed ACT to a timed SAT, because the time constraint is the hardest part of the ACT for most students. The last thing is that science section on the ACT. If you try the practice ACT and you absolutely bomb that science section and you don't know if you can do it fast enough, that could be the determining factor that tilts you towards the SAT. So keep these things in mind: the difficulty of the passages, the science section on the ACT, the type of math, whether it's geometry or algebra 2, and then the amount of time per question. These 4 categories are going to help you decide which test is going to make the most sense for you. But again, I really encourage students to try both. Take a practice SAT, take a practice ACT, and use that to help you determine which one makes the most sense for you. Because again, from the college's perspective, it does not matter which test you take. So all of this information will hopefully help you make an informed decision, especially if your family is short on time or short on resources and you can't afford to go and take both tests, or take both tests multiple times, or take one test multiple times. You can use the information in this video to determine which test is going to make the most sense for you, so that you can take your SAT or ACT once, maybe twice, and then be finished. I usually don't recommend students take the test more than 3 times. So don't feel overwhelmed and don't feel like you have to take it again and again to get a perfect score. We'll talk more about scores in a future video, and when you should supply your score, or when you might consider not supplying your score to colleges when you go to apply. In the next video, we will be talking about the digital SAT and how that's different from the paper SAT. It's coming in March 2024, we think. That's what College Board has announced anyway. And so that'll be the next video on Monday of next week. And then after that, we will talk about the scores and when you should submit your scores, when you might consider not submitting your scores, and help you make that kind of determination for you and your family as well. So I hope you found this video helpful. Again, if you want to see the blog post with all the information in this video, it's in the description below. You can also go to my website below and check out some of the resources. I have some test prep resources in there if you need help. There's some personal, like, self-help ones. And then there are also some private tutoring options that are in the description, or in the resources page on my website as well, that can help you out. And again, if you have any questions that you want me to answer or things you want me to address in a video, you can email me at collegequestions@dawesacademics.com. That's DAWES academics.com. And I'll see you next week.